Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and today we're taking a look at the new Tzeentch trailer that just dropped alongside a very chunky blog post full of campaign mechanics to gawk over. I'm really very happy to see this 1-2 punch of dropping a new trailer with some new units and visuals to look over in general, alongside a very meaty blog post that shares details about how things will actually work in-game. It feels like a nice balance of information being shared, so kudos are deserved on that. Props to everybody involved in making that change, and it's fitting to make a change when talking about Tzeentch after all. Either way, jokes aside, I'm really glad it's happened. It means there's a lot of juicy stuff to talk about today, and as such, feel free to use the timestamps below to find the sections you're most curious about. Oh, little time to waste. Let's dive right on in.
It is foreseen. Change was inevitable. Masters of manipulation, orchestrators of grand complexity. By the architect of fate. Do you seek the ultimate truth? We reveal the unfathomable. Manipulate fate.
Alright, that's a pretty solid trailer. I'll be honest, I prefer the Cathay reveal trailer. The pacing and cinematography on that one was so epic, it's going to be hard to beat. I still like this one, and it pains me to say that I prefer the Cathay one because, again, if you're familiar with the channel, you know I'm a huge fan of Tzeentch, so it is what it is though. Still a good trailer, don't get me wrong. And also,
it is foreseen.
I do think this might be my favorite voice in all of Total War Warhammer history, just across all three games. This is, I absolutely love it. Now, Karos, Fate Weaver, we've already seen before in battle with Cathay, so we knew he was coming. Again, he's got a head to see the future, a head that sees the past, and a blindness to the present. I'm really curious to see how he's implemented as far as both battle and campaign mechanics are concerned. He only ever leaves the impossible fortress on the most important of tasks, and I suppose bringing about the end of the mortal realm in service of his lord counts as such a time. Being the right hand of Tzeentch means he wields great power, but also has great expectations set upon him. We've seen him be able to fly in battle footage, so no surprise here as he joins a bunch of disc riders that we, again, have seen previously. I'm going to try not to focus too much on units we've already seen before. You can watch my Cathay reveal trailer analysis for some of these units, but these guys over here, again, they're armed with halberds and they're wearing heavy armor, so I'm suspecting, armor over 100, anti-large, armor piercing, and I see they're carrying shields too, so I assume those will give them that front arc protection from ranged fire at a silver shield sort of level. This looks like a magic damage causing cultist cavalry unit. Maybe a bit on the lighter side as far as armor and protection is concerned, and they're definitely a unit because you can see a bunch of them together in this shot over here, and they remind me a bit of the Doomfire Warlocks in perhaps their application and maybe even visually how their attack animations and stuff play out, with a reliance on kind of special effects to make it look like they're casting, because they are carrying staffs, but I don't think they're ranged casters. We'll find out when eventually the roster reveal happens, of course. Alright, I absolutely adore these little guys. I wonder, though, if we're going to see the pink horror to blue horror transition that we discussed when they were first revealed. Again, we've talked about these guys in the past, but recent footage that we've seen doesn't show the splitting of one dying pink horror into two blue horrors. But it is possible that it's just not being shown for trailer purposes. Maybe, like, visually it doesn't work so well in a trailer, and so they're just not showing it. That's a perfectly fair thing to do, in my opinion at least. I'm just curious, though, if there are plans to implement it at all. Maybe when the last entity in a pink horror unit dies, it spawns 2 blue horror units as opposed to kind of doing an individual thing, because based on how Total War games work and how they kind of calculate their units and work with their units, I think it would be impossible, I think, to have each individual entity spawn 2 separate entities. Who knows, though? I mean, these guys literally implemented dragons in a franchise that was previously historical and grounded, so I'm sure they could figure out a way to do it. They're probably choosing not to for some reason or another. Time will tell. On that note, though, we still haven't seen Brimstone Horrors. Now, if memory serves me right, Brimstone Horrors are an Age of Sigmar edition. However, these demon designs and some of these units are clearly inspired by Age of Sigmar demons and things like that, so I wouldn't be surprised if we do end up seeing Brimstone Horrors, but they might not be in the base game. We have, however, seen Exalted Pink Horrors. They came up in the Siege rework video, and they're also in the concept art from the blog that just dropped, so we can expect a bulkier pink horror variant that has a bit more survivability and damage output too, I would suspect. At least that's what it looks like. And then that begs the question, if there is a spawning of blue horrors off of pink horrors, do exalted pink horrors spawn exalted blue horrors? It's all speculation. I'm going to say probably not. I'm going to say we might not even see this kind of like splitting, spawning going on, but time will tell. There's more going on here though. If we pull it back just a little bit, we can see what looks like multiple units of maybe Heralds of Tzeentch on burning chariots. They're coming in with a pair of assistants on each disc as well from the look of it. And these guys are spellcasters, but I'm curious if they'll appear with spells in a regular sense using the Winds of Magic, or if they'll be bound abilities instead. Some of the stuff we talk about later on in this video as they pertain to sort of campaign mechanics would suggest a reliance on Winds of Magic, with little concern of running out of Winds of Magic. Again, this is Tzeentch we're talking about, so we will have control over those Winds of Magic, and we should be able to supercharge them, before a battle begins. So I imagine it's quite possible that we'd have many units that rely on Winds of Magic, rather than having to sort of spread spell casting into bound abilities as well, in order to keep Winds of Magic exclusive to specific units. Again, we'll see all in due time, but it's just a thought that crossed my mind based on some of the campaign mechanic stuff that we're going to talk about later on. Now, these guys will be very quick to move around, and that should help with their survivability too, and this Chariot variant specifically will probably be able to mow down the occasional infantry unit as well, but again, they're still casters, so I suspect they wouldn't have too much of a survivability if they get caught up in melee combat. We can also see the regular Burning Chariot of Tzeentch, Exalted Flamer riding atop. If Flamers and Exalted Flamers are ranged units, then these will be ranged Chariot units. But if the range of the Exalted Flamer and the regular Flamer as well is just an animation when they're actually technically engaged in melee, I suspect we'll get the same here. These guys will just be melee chariots. Now, these chariots are definitely far higher above the ground than I'd expect. I mean, they are being pulled along by screamers, so that makes sense. But typically, if I recall the models correctly, they look as though they're just slightly hovering above the ground. They're not like on those little plastic pieces that make them look like they're flying. So I'm curious if this is just an interpretation for the trailer, or if they're actually going to be classified as flyers in the game and, be susceptible to the associated risks and rewards. Heralds of Tzeentch are looking great on foot as well. Again, spellcasters here, and based on something we'll discuss later, again, I'm leaning towards them using Winds of Magic rather than bound abilities, whether they're on foot or on chariots. A much closer look at the Screamers of Tzeentch here. Again, we've discussed them previously, so I won't get into too much detail, but I really expect them to be armor-piercing, or at least maybe sundering with all these sharp bits. They could be a very solid sort of support unit. They could be harassment units. I expect they'll be pretty quick to move around, but I would like to see those very, very sharp teeth come in handy to soften up potential enemy targets. Now here's a familiar face, hopefully coming in with some upgrades. Tzeentch might be a hero here, as opposed to a legendary lord, because the implication, again, from the blog post and from everything else Creative Assembly have said, is that the Chaos factions are launching with only one legendary lord each, unless I've completely misunderstood them, which would imply that Tzeentch here would be a hero, perhaps a legendary hero, right? Because he is a named character and all that. In which case, will we see Archaon and Sigvald and the like all get similar treatment? Either way, this is also a good indication that the Lord of Change will be available as a generic Lord variant too. Now here we have maybe some anti-air spells going down. Not exactly sure, this could just be, again, visualizations for the trailer, but it does look like it's a specific spell that's causing kind of anti-air damage over here. And now we're looking at Flamers and Exalted Flamers as well. It really looks like they're being treated as melee units, or they have extremely short ranges perhaps. Naturally, Exalted Flamers will be a bit more powerful than their regular counterparts, causing more damage and just generally being tankier, but if they end up being ranged, Exalted Flamers should be able to fire further than the regular variant. I'm not sure, again, if they're going to go ranged or melee. It's hard to tell, and again, these are just trailers, so even though they might be using in-game models and things like that, a lot of the decisions being made with regards to positioning and the way they're actually, animated and behaving is based on what looks good. That's the function of these trailers, is to show, it's an exercise in storytelling as opposed to an exercise in showing us actual mechanics. So a lot of this is very interpretive, of course. Alright, with the trailer tackled, it's time to dive into some of the campaign details from the blog post. Playing as the Lord of Change, Kairos Fateweaver will be leading the Oracles of Tzeentch in the invasion of Cathay and subsequently the world. On which note, it's important to keep in mind that the mechanics we're talking about today are centered around Tzeentch factions. That means we're not talking about Kairos' faction specifically, and it means that any new paid and free DLC that adds Tzeentch-themed lords and factions will include most, if not all, of these mechanics, and then their own mechanics on top of them to set them apart. All sub-factions under Tzeentch, including Kairos, we know nothing about, so we'll talk about that later when all that information is revealed. So again, speaking generically about Tzeentch, Grimoires are a unique resource for Tzeentch, a representation of forbidden texts, ancient lore, unknown histories, all manner of knowledge in the world that Tzeentch is, of course, interested in. Having more Grimoires impresses Tzeentch, which in turn might bring his rewards. It sounds like Grimoires are acquired through standard Total War actions like battles, buildings, sacking, event chains, and that kind of stuff. But where things get juicy are in the use of these Grimoires. Now, I suspect that each faction will have access to what we're about to discuss, but I wouldn't be surprised if each sub-faction, as they release, will have additional uses of Grimoires as well. But again, that's speculation, maybe let's set that aside. So changing of the ways is the primary way in which to spend Grimoires, and some of these are pretty powerful tools. They come with appropriate costs, or so I imagine. It is hard to tell until we see the rate at which you can acquire Grimoires, but I'm wholeheartedly on board with these being powerful tools. Not so powerful that they inherently give the player even more snowballing right off the bat, but powerful enough to represent the interference of a literal god, right? As you can tell from the interface, most of these require certain tech unlocks to actually have access to them. In fact, all of these, outside of transfer settlement, require some tech or another. Reveal faction intentions shows plans of armies controlled by the target faction. Presumably you'll be able to see what they're planning on attacking or details on their recruitment decisions and things like that. Track army gives you line of sight of a target army. Now, I'm a little confused by the verbiage here. I assume track army would give you line of sight on a target army, like you're able to track them into the fog of war for a handful of turns, but the phrasing here makes it sound like you're able to see what they're able to see, including themselves, for maybe a set number of turns. I'm cool with either of those abilities, of course, but I'm just not clear exactly which we're actually looking at. If you have any theories, feel free to share. Halt Faction stops the armies and heroes of a faction dead in their tracks for the next turn. That is a great way to prevent reinforcements from arriving at a location or to help one of your retreating armies get away from a precarious situation. That is such a powerful and useful tool. Break Alliance forces the breaking of military or defensive pacts between two factions. Again, I don't think I have to describe why that is such a powerful tool. Break a defensive pact just before you declare a fresh war. That's absolutely huge. It can absolutely change your next steps in a campaign. I love it. I absolutely love it. Transfer Settlement lets you change who controls a specific settlement. You can transfer control over to any new faction, including your own. Reveal Shroud gives you complete vision of a target faction's territory, while Force Rebellion causes a rebellion in the targeted region. I'm not sure of what strength. I'm not sure if it maybe is determined by local corruption levels or anything like that. But I imagine, it won't be too easy to deal with, otherwise you're wasting a lot of resources you've worked hard to gain in order to, cause a nuisance as opposed to an actual threat, compared to especially some of these other abilities. Open Gates, meanwhile, will open the gates of a major settlement's walls for a few turns, and again, that can save you quite a bit of time. Give War Coordination target will allow you to tell a faction what to attack, whether they're your ally or not, though I do wonder if you can tell them to attack the city of a faction they're not already at war with. I imagine no, because Force War is probably what you'll need to use for that war declaration. There are some very cheeky ways these tools can be used, and I'm really excited to see this kind of stuff get included in the game. A lot of these options sort of break, air quotes, Total War, so to speak, and that's really what I was hoping to see with the Chaos Gods. In a sort of way, Tzeentch is getting extra diplomatic options, and while I was hoping for more sort of literal or traditional interpretations of hyper-diplomatic Tzeentch cultists and things like that, I think this will do quite nicely. I'm not sure what the in-universe explanation is. Like, it could just be straight-up magic, or it could be the cult of Tzeentch doing its nefarious deeds and working across various strata of society in obedience of their lord. It's actual spies infiltrating the noble circles and instigating wars. It's spies, managing to open the gates. Like, how is this going to be represented? I'm very curious, but either way, I think it's pretty neat. This is honestly, and it sounds like it'd be fun for multiplayer as well. Very excited to see how these things play, and this makes me even more excited for all the other Chaos Gods. Now, anyway, let's move on. Winds of Magic manipulation is another big factor for Tzeentch factions, as I was saying earlier, and quite a few Tzeentch faction buildings have their performance tied to the Winds of Magic. Now, because of the importance of said winds and Tzeentch's prowess in this area, his factions are able to manipulate the winds themselves, weakening them in one owned province to strengthen them in another. Considering you're going to be using the Winds of Magic quite a bit when playing as Tzeentch, chances are you're going to use these wind-blowing abilities quite a bit to make sure you're always fighting at the best of your ability, and with all the advantages that Tzeentch can offer you. An excellent example being, Tzeentch armies can adopt a teleport stance at the cost of Winds of Magic. This allows for the crossing of impassable terrain, it allows for, skipping past patrolling armies and things like that, and it also allows the teleporting army to ambush a target army. Now, you have to readopt the stance after each use, so yes, it's very expensive, but still, a well-placed ambush can turn an entire war around, and that's why it's locked behind certain tech. Tech for Tzeentch is a little differently structured as per the blog post. It's laid out more like a web, spiraling out from the center, and each separate group of techs is unlocked by researching a central tech first. The blog suggests that this structure means you won't use the exact same path through the tree, or web, I guess, across multiple playthroughs unless you have something specific in mind, but I feel like that's always the case. Like, I'm not sure what I'm missing here that makes this so much more likely to invite, like, alternative choices as opposed to a regular tree layout. I guess it'll be more evident when I get to sit down with it, but I am curious, and again, maybe I'm missing something, but to me it sounds like it's differently structured, sure, and it works a little uniquely, but as far as not going down the same path, I don't know. I feel like every time I pick a faction, I always have the option to not go down the same path if I'm taking a different approach, using a different build. So again, just a little curious about what it's getting at over here. Now, some unique elements that stand out with Tzeentch are texts that unlock spells for all Lords of Change, and texts that allow the use of monstrous spellcasters as the entirety of an army without a cost to hero slots. Tzeentch's learning focus also means that his factions have many ways to improve research speed, so you can actually tech rush pretty hard and get an advantage if you choose to do so. Beyond Tzeentch, there are a few mechanics tied to all of the Chaos Gods that we actually got our first glimpse of in this blog post. The Great Game will have, as expected, the 4 Chaos factions compete for ascendancy. In my speculation videos, I talked a little bit about how I expected this to be paired off for opposing gods, but it sounds more like all 4 gods are competing at the same time, and it's less about who's doing better or worse than the other, and more about just how your own god is doing. That is to say, since corruption now exists for each god individually, each god only cares for the level of their own corruption. They're not fussed about the opposition doing well or poorly, or even doing significantly better. As you accumulate your specific brand of corruption, you'll have access to Unholy Manifestations. These are all abilities that are god-specific, and they're unlocked as, again, your specific brand of corruption spreads across the map. It's great to see corruption serve more of a purpose than just cause things like attrition. This is, again, it's actually meaty stuff. It makes corruption more interesting, which I was expecting because this game is, all about chaos and all that kind of stuff. So it's really cool to see how those expectations are being met, as it were, and how they're actually implementing some of these interesting ideas. So first for Tzeentch among these Unholy Manifestations is Scriveners of Insanity. Unlocked right from the beginning, it allows friendly armies to generate grimoires while standing still in enemy territory for several turns. At 1500 global Tzeentch corruption, Mutagenic Energies is unlocked, allowing you to target an army and have it suffer attrition, disregarding any immunities. Magic Flare is available at 3000 global Tzeentch corruption, increasing range and barrier hit points of all units in a specific army. Now, barrier is a force field-like shield that Tzeentch's units have, and I think we saw a barrier specific hit point bar that shows the barrier in action alongside clear indication of, I think, the barrier popping, all shown during the Siege rework reveal. Finally, Night of Madness requires 6,000 global Tzeentch corruption and lets you pick a target-friendly army that will generate further Tzeentch corruption and increase its Winds of Magic power reserve. The army will also reduce control in the province, control being the new term for public order, and it will be locked in place when this is active. I would really like to see more of these kinds of abilities, and I say that as a full-fledged compliment. I think these are fun ideas, and so I want to see more of them. None of these seem particularly overly powerful per se, which is great, but a well-placed hit of attrition or a boost to HP for a crucial battle can make a world of difference when used at the right time. Again, I can't really comment on things like cooldown periods or how long it takes to acquire enough corruption to use any of these, but I'm sure those are all being tweaked and figured out anyway. Exciting stuff nonetheless, and that's not where corruption ends. Cults are an active outcome of corruption and are a very good representation of the competition between gods. We're going to see passive benefits of corruption for each god, and though we don't have specifics, I think there are some maybe safe guesses we might be able to make. More Tzeentch corruption might mean better Winds of Magic in a region, while more Khorne corruption might mean better weapon strength and melee stats. Maybe eventually adding Berserker to certain units. More Nurgle corruption might mean better replenishment rates, perhaps even better armor from all the boils and pus that covers bodies. I don't know. But Nurgle, I imagine, would help with longevity and replenishment rates. And Slaanesh corruption might result in, oh god, let's call it higher growth rates, maybe? Maybe better physical resistance or something like that as well. Our imaginations can run wild, and I'm curious what you think too, but I don't want to over-speculate on this just quite yet. I do, however, want to talk about those cults. Once a god is particularly dominant in a region, which I assume to mean once their specific brand of corruption crosses a threshold, a cult can form dedicated to said god. This cult becomes a foreign building slot like a pirate cove or undercity, and it'll have access to unique god-specific buildings. Tzeentch can build a sanctuary to generate grimoires per turn, a repository to generate more grimoires per turn as long as there are higher winds of magic in the region, while a sanctum generates income with a high enough winds of magic level, and finally a campus which destroys the cult but increases winds of magic at the province and adjacent provinces to tempestuous. This all makes corruption so much more important. I see actual value in spreading Tzeentch corruption, for example, in order to generate more grimoires that in turn help you force open gates, throw your enemies against each other, or transfer control of settlements as you please. Could it be possible to play a Tzeentch game with minimal military action? I don't mean none, but less than the usual? God, I'm really excited about this, and I'm trying to temper my expectations. But again, as a Tzeentch fan, and just as somebody who likes to see more ways to play in his strategy games, this kind of stuff really hits the spot in my books. As promised, lots to talk about with today's reveals, and all this talk of Tzeentch today doesn't even include faction-specific stuff, so hopefully we'll learn more about Chariots on the campaign map very soon as well. I'm looking forward to similar posts about the other factions, and while I don't typically cover blog posts on the channel when they come out on their own, I might have some plans moving forward, especially if they're as packed as this one and the Cathay one were. Now let me know if you'd be interested in those down below. Leave a comment, and again, as always, don't hesitate to subscribe for more Total War and strategy gaming content in general. But what do you guys think about everything we've seen today? Tzeentch is definitely feeling Tzeentchy. The campaign mechanics look compelling, and I'm curious just how far they can be bent. As always, a massive thanks goes out to all of the channel members and patrons who've been supporting the channel on a monthly basis. Y'all keep us alive and running smoothly. And of course, a big old thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.